All right, everybody. Welcome to the pod. I'm here with John Vokal. Is that how you pronounce your last name?
Vocal, just like the
Vocal.
throat
Right
muscle.
on. John is someone who I met, gosh, 3, 4 years ago while I was touring. The band I was in played a show in the Detroit area, and John was in one of the opening bands. And we kind of hit it off in the parking lot, just talking about life and politics and all that good stuff. And here we are 4 years later. um, John works in public policy, and he's also in a great band. What's the name of your band again?
Blank slate.
Blank Slate. That's right. And his girlfriend's a killer bassist too.
She really is.
So I wanted to have John on because him and I have, we've got some overlapping opinions that I guess you could say are uh, kind of strangely controversial these days, just because everything is such a hot button topic. And John, working in public policy and economics, I think has some really great insights uh, to share regarding markets and capitalism and all that really convoluted stuff that seems to have such a political, it's so politicized these days. So I just wanted to, have you on to talk about that, and just see where we go.
Yeah. So I will say, you and I started striking common ground, not
Mhm.
as a proponent of our political beliefs in general, but more so the idea that political discussion, discourse, things like that are kind of dying off.
Absolutely.
And, extending this into economics, I would make the claim that while economics does have political implications,
Hmm.
it is not an inherently political thing, right?
Right.
So I was really shocked just as like this summer, right? And
Hmm.
again, like I do this for a job. I do a lot of economic research. This is not necessarily stuff that I consider I'm like making edgy takes on or trying to get into fights with people with.
Totally.
And I was really upsetting people, random people on the internet, of course, but getting like super offended about the idea that like, I believe in the general idea of a free market, and that there's
Hmm.
like no discussion like that. I was literally called oh, that's a hateful opinion because free markets create imperialism, or kind of claims like that, right? So I
Absolutely.
think this is a great opportunity to talk about, one, the politicization of economics, and
Hmm.
two, how it's not inherently a right or left wing thing and doesn't need to be
Right.
viewed through that lens. Because,
Totally.
there's a lot of things that I can agree with on what would be considered leftist economics, but I don't view them
Totally.
as leftists. I just think of them as economic. So
Or at least to come to a place where you can empathize with the other person's perspective. And I mean, so much of my understanding and really my interest in politics is this idea that politics is it's the space in which people have to compromise for the common good of everybody. I mean, that's the idea, really. There's never been a period in history where one person gets everything
oh,
that. You there? Oh, perfect, perfect. It like glitched for a second.
yeah, lost you for a
Um,
second, but now we're
oh, no
back.
worries.
Yeah. Okay. Just
Sweet.
repeat that last sentence.
Yeah, but kind of, what I was saying was politics is it's a dynamic thing, and it requires people of different viewpoints and different experiences and different knowledge bases to come together to try and do something for the common good of everybody. It's messy and it's complicated, and I really resonate with what you said about um, because I've been in that situation too, where I say something that I don't think is controversial, or at least maybe it's controversial to the far end of one political spectrum. Um, and I think it's, these last couple of years has really kind of brought out the wolves in that sense where, and, there's a lot of factors in why that is, but people are very guarded about their opinions, specifically how it relates to economics and markets. And, I mean, you and I both know that the word capitalism, like just that word, is such a uh, it brings it's like has all these connotations now with people,
Right. I
and it's kind of
literally
hard.
avoid the word now. Like I
Right.
refuse to use the word capitalism when I'm discussing economics with anybody.
Mhm.
I've substituted it fully for markets, right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
and not only because I do think there might be nuances in the way that people interpretate that, but I think at the
Mhm.
end of the day, I'm also saying like I'm not for like a bunch of powerful people going and hoarding as much wealth as possible and
Right.
at any cost to do so, but more so the idea that when people have the ability to freely exchange with one another in an economic
Mhm.
sense, that creates good results, right?
Yeah.
I guess those are two different perspectives, but yeah, I mean, capitalism's a supercharged word, right?
Right.
For I don't know what
So
reason, but it is.
so could you take us to just kind of the just the essence of a market? So how would you describe it to someone who has absolutely um, no economic understanding? I mean, they participate in the market, but they don't understand really the history or nuance of the term and what it means.
Sure. So I think that, there's a lot of great introductions, and like I've been through enough economics 101 classes where I've kind of heard people explain this in different ways. And
Hmm.
the one that always resonates the most with me is that there's a scarce amount of everything. There's a scarce supply of everything, right? And I think economics is the study of two things: that one, choice, right? How which things we choose over other things in order to create better situations, and then two, interaction, right? Where there's a human element to economics, and I think people separate those two things way too often. But like
Right.
us just exchanging with one another, be it ideas, be it labor, be it products, whatever,
Hmm.
it's all economic activity in one way
Right.
or another, right? So to have a strong anti-free market stance from my perspective is going and saying I don't want people to voluntarily exchange goods, services, whatever with one another,
Right.
right?
Right.
um, and then I can kind of get into you know what differences there are with that, as far as like, because of that, I'm more anti-regulation, right?
Hmm.
And I think, people initially say that's a right-wing stance, but one of the research papers that I did was regulation on something known as occupational licensing, right? Which
Hmm.
is like the amount of prerequisites required to get a job to do something.
Right. I know, and I
And
actually you sent that to me, and it was really interesting. And here's just a quote that I wrote down because it's not said enough, and I thought that this was a really good insight. But you said occupational licensing is now a regulatory weapon used to establish unfair and inconsistent standards amongst all sorts of low-skilled occupations. As mentioned earlier, Michigan, which is where you're from, requires 49 out of 102 common lower-income occupations to be subject to a variety of occupational licensing and regulation. That really blew my mind, if I'm being honest. And I'm sure it's worse
yeah.
in California too.
Oh yeah, I think California is one of the top ranking states for it.
Yeah,
Louisiana is a really big one too, and the reason why I
interesting.
referenced that is because there's a story that I kind of included that I kept it short and sweet inside of the essay, but if I could kind of expound it long form. So Louisiana had a strict occupational licensing laws against being a florist, being a
Hmm.
practicing florist, right? Now, there's a bunch of funny stuff that has to do with like the Supreme Court rulings that made that permissible and things like that. But the
Hmm.
root reason why they wanted to have occupational licensing for being a florist is because Florida was kicking their ass in the flower market because they had a way better climate for it.
Right.
So, okay, well, if we just make it so that you have to be a Louisiana licensed florist to sell flowers, then
Hmm.
we're not going to have to compete with Florida anymore, and we can have our own kind of protectionism and regulation there.
Hmm.
And there was a woman named Sandy who was low income, and she actually, had a skill set in being a florist. The problem is that the grading system for whether or not you knew how to be a proper florist was super arbitrary, and it was
Hmm.
actually used as a discriminatory and racist measure to keep people out of that market.
Hmm.
And here's this is the most mind-blowing fact: the passage rate for the test to become a florist was lower than the passage rate for the Louisiana bar exam to become a lawyer. So that's how
That's
tough it was to
insane.
become a florist. Right. So yeah, so super sad ending, but Sandy, who the story is about, actually was told that she wasn't allowed to work at a grocery store. The literal government came in and forced the grocery store to fire her because she didn't have a license. and
Jesus.
she had a high risk surgery and literally couldn't afford to keep the electricity on in her house, and she actually died in recovery from that surgery. And obviously, I'm not saying that florist licenses killed her, but the fact that
Right.
she wasn't employed contributed to it.
Right.
So
Yeah, God, that is a crazy story. You also referenced, I've got it up here, similar to that, occupational licensing for, um, actually, so, well, let me rewind a second. So kind of one thing that I took from your paper is this idea that there, the regulation has created administration jobs, which don't actually technically add to the labor market. More, they kind of just act as filler positions without, um, again, I'm kind of an economic idiot, but I kind of think of like things like in the 1950s, innovation, like you could only get so many new appliances in your kitchen before
right.
that stopped. And then eventually all these companies have to shift to something else, but you see this this need for growth to continue. um, and it just from what I took from it, it inflated these administration positions without providing anything meaningful. Is that a sort of accurate take? Or
Yeah, so I think one of the best examples of that I used was the healthcare market. And
right.
again, healthcare is a very controversial, hot button issue.
Hmm.
And I think the idea is that we must move to a single payer program in order for us to have a better healthcare system.
Yeah.
And what I draw attention to here is that the government started regulating healthcare significantly more around the New Deal era.
Hmm.
And the result of that was the number of medical administrators, like you said, which are basically paper pushers for
Right.
regulation, for records, for things like that,
Totally.
increased 27 times in the same amount of time that the number of practicing physicians doubled, right?
Right.
So it's outpacing the growth of doctors rate by 14 times. That's a massive
That's
amount, and the
insane.
costs associated with it. I mean, those are salaries you're paying, and decent,
Right.
middle income salaries. Think about what kind of cost it's adding on healthcare, and that's mostly a regulatory issue, right? So
Hmm.
there's that secondary effect that maybe some people aren't thinking about when you consider, let's step in and let's fix the healthcare market, and then your
Right.
result is something like that, which is going to obviously increase the costs.
Do you think having a blended system, like, because I sort of, how I look at it is, it would be great if, and I think a lot of the healthcare issue relates specifically to options within certain tax brackets. Like I know in California, it's really hard to get healthcare if you are, like, you have to be so poor that you can get free healthcare. But if you're still really, really, really poor, but just not within the lowest tier, you can't. Um, so do you think like a blended system, or something that, like, there is a government option as well as the option to pursue it in the free market? Like, what do you think might be a good way to go about solving this problem from like a realistic standpoint?
So I think this is a great segue into a couple things, and I'm going
Mhm.
to touch on healthcare and then kind of move into a little bit education and the welfare
Totally.
state at large, if that's cool with you.
I'm all about it, man.
Um, so people have this idea that European systems have purely free healthcare all around, and it's so much better than the American system, and it's not totally incorrect.
Hmm.
But we need to tread lightly when we're talking about like a regulated healthcare market and a subsidized healthcare market, because
Right.
you can
We pay
keep
for the
free,
subsidies.
exactly, so you
Mhm.
can like keep free market functions intact while still having funding. And this is kind of the model that Sweden has for most of their social programs. Is the government is footing the bill, but there's not a whole lot of red tape, right? They're
Mhm.
not saying this is how you have to do it. You can't do it this way. You have to do it the government's way. It's more
Right.
so, here's some funding. Go compete with one another, and a winner is going to end up in a better position because of it.
Right.
So I'm gonna take that too into school of choice for a
Mhm.
second, right? And talk about same concept, right?
And real
Instead
quick,
of
before you do that, I always like to make the note that a country like Sweden is like 3 million people, and it's like 98% Swedish people. So those types of large scale social programs are inherently going to be much easier to implement when there's sort of a shared national culture. I mean, you see that all in all those Nordic countries that constantly get referenced. People kind of tend, in my opinion, they tend to forget the fact that it's a fairly homogenous society in that sense. But
Right.
anyway,
And
yeah.
and it does kind of drive me crazy too when people say that all of those countries are socialist countries, because I don't think that's an
They're not.
accurate description of what they are. I think they're very much just a neoliberal society, which is, not too many steps away from what America was probably 30, 40 years ago. I'd say we've
Hmm.
moved into a different system that I'm reluctant to label.
Hmm.
But that was essentially the model, is we had social programs and they worked pretty well, and we still let the free market do its thing. But Sweden does have that advantage of they're more homogenous in their culture and their demographics, and they're also healthier, right?
Way
People
healthier.
don't like having that conversation, is that America is incredibly unhealthy and incredibly overweight, and that is going to bog down a free system. Like, it's
Right.
just, um,
Absolutely.
but similar to their healthcare system, their schooling system works in a similar way, where they're footing the bill, but they're kind of letting the free market at work. And I think the right and the left can agree that our health, or not our healthcare, our education system is really bogged down and having a lot of issues. Right.
Hmm.
Literacy rates in urban areas are dropping at an exponential rate. Well, how is one of the richest, most prosperous countries in the world struggling to educate people?
Right.
And I think there's a racist component there. Absolutely. Actually, public education is historically racist, right? I mean, we can draw
Right.
that to the origins of public education all the way to now, that there is a lot of racist undertones,
Hmm.
you know, uh, minimally. But, I think if we move to a system where the schools have to compete for funding, and they have to
Hmm.
compete for students, and students can have the mobility to go to whichever school that they want, that is going to force those, again, free market components of allowing people to actually have to compete with one another, create a better product, educate people better, create demand for what they're doing, but still have the ability to pay for those things for people that can't necessarily pay for themselves. A fully private school system obviously wouldn't work, because that would
Right.
totally undermine people that can't afford such things. But
Well,
the
and
ability
also
to,
they're
sorry,
accountable
go ahead.
to they're it's more accountable to the parents, which I think is a huge factor. I'm reading this book right now because I'm going into education, and I'm reading this book called The Cult of Smart, and it's written by a dude who is very I think he's a professor at Brown University in education, very left leaning, like most people in education are, but he's
Right.
making the case essentially that what what we really need is to be more scientific about, first of all, the heritability of intelligence. So we kind of
Mhm.
treat and like No Child Left Behind did this, and that was a bipartisan, that was Democrat and Republicans that pushed that through, and this idea that everyone deserves a college education is really not. I mean, and he talks about Sweden a lot. Kids in Sweden aren't reading at parents don't care if their kids can't read by the age of 3, because that's not, they know that they will eventually, and they're getting a much more, when you're that young, what you need to be doing is developing social skills, learning how to interact with others. That's a crucial time, and we sort of box in every kid pretending that they are going to be the next astronaut, the next engineer, when the reality is
Right.
is that very few people have that skill set. And you see it very early on. He was saying that um, uh, there's like basically like a 90% correlation between kids who struggle in math at 3 years old, basic math, and those same kids struggling 12, 13 years later, adjusted for socioeconomic status. And so what he's saying is like, look, we need to go into poor schools and say, hey, what you have an opportunity to do. I'm a plumber, I'm an electrician. Um, these are skills that are always going to exist, are always going to be needed. And what better way to invigorate a poor community than with skills that you can use in that poor community, rather than say, oh, you better graduate so you can go get a degree. And as the reality is, those kids have a much more um, immediate concern, if they're not already going to
Right.
drop out, to just go get a job. wherever, you know?
No, absolutely. And I think you're really, hurting people by trying to box them into that. Not everybody, you're right.
Right.
Not everybody's meant for a college education. And I think you're actually delaying their ability to, make decent money in the world by forcing that on them.
Yeah.
And, so Corey DeAngelis, who's a
I
scholar
know
with
Corey.
the Reason Foundation. Yeah. So, he's very pro school choice, and his entire proposal is we should move to an education universal basic income
Mm,
where families get $10,000 a year per student and you go to whatever school that you want, right?
interesting. Yeah.
So money isn't as much of an issue, and the free market is still at work at, people might be deficient in math skills. So
Hmm.
maybe at an earlier age parents can start paying for an education that's more catered to whatever it is else that they're good at. And
Right.
at the same time, maybe kids find out they're really passionate about engineering and physics at an early age, which I'll admit that I don't think there's a whole lot of those, but maybe there
Right.
are. And you can
Totally.
start catering to that at an early age, because
Hmm.
brains are sponges in your adolescence, and they can really pick up a lot of amazing things and skill sets at a very
Yeah.
early start. But the point is that you have to start early on it.
Totally.
Um, so, and I'm sorry, I didn't know you were going into education, but like, do
Yeah.
you know
Well,
which
so
area you're like going
initially,
into?
well, what I wanted to do was I'm graduating in May with my undergraduate degree in English. Um, and what I've wanted to do for most of my life is be an English teacher or a history teacher. It's kind of this sort of large cloud of irony that I'm sort of in right now, is that I have a lot of friends who are teaching in California and they're
Mhm.
working 60 hours a week and the pay is terrible. And frankly, the state politics in social science curriculum is something that I have a lot of issues with. And so what I'm doing is graduating and then I'm going into education technology. So I'm pivoting more towards um, wanting to work at like an education technology company, wanting to learn how to develop education based apps and things like that. Cause I mean, again, that to me, that realization that, well, I think maybe the free market is the solution in this scenario. And I go back to thinking like just throughout my own school career, I have learned more through looking up things on YouTube and
Yep.
finding content of people who might not even be in education. And you see that teachers do that all the time, where they abdicate their responsibilities um, to someone else, essentially. And for me, it's like I'm a more visual kinesthetic learner, and I never really, school never really worked for me in a lot of ways. So I'm starting a graduate program in the fall in education technology, and that's where I'm going.
That's
Hopefully,
awesome.
I want to teach. I do want to teach in a classroom. I do obviously think that's valuable, but I'm sort of trying to cover my own ass a little bit here and see what else is going on and take that into consideration too.
Well, you could be kind of seeing where the education market's going in that sense too, because
Yeah.
same sentiment, even at a college level, right? Like my
Hmm.
computer can give me a better lesson on a topic that I'm passionate about than
Right.
perhaps my graduate teacher can.
Totally.
And that's not to discredit my graduate teacher's brilliance by any mean,
Hmm.
but more so the fact that the internet is literally an endless source of information.
Right.
And and it can start simple in an engaging way. Like Kurzgesagt is a great example of a YouTube channel that, like, you can put that on for an 8-year-old, and for the most part
Right.
they could probably follow it along, because it's actually, there's so much effort into like making it visual and explaining it and stuff. And then, like,
Totally.
I started with that, and like a few weeks later I was on like astrophysics binge as a result of
Yeah.
that, and actually looking at like actual astrophysics stuff on the
Right.
internet. And I'm like,
Yeah.
this is information that was probably only accessible to regular people, like, as of this most recent decade. And
Right.
previously you did have to go through a formal education to get that resource, but now
Totally.
it's getting disvalued,
It's opened up.
devalued. Yeah.
And there's a lot of,
Great.
and there's something again he talks about in this book, um, and there's been a few, like John Ogbu, who's like a pretty famous educator, sorry, has talked about just the fact that we don't, and you talked about this in your paper, there are certain professions that you should require certain licenses and certain skills, and they're held to a very high standard. And it's not easy to become a teacher, but they don't screen for things that are never really considered in the teaching environment are the teacher themselves, who could be absolutely terrible. I've had teachers that have punched out my willingness to want to learn something based on just how
100%.
they, and that is something that never gets taken into consideration, in my eyes. And then I've had teachers that inspire me to want to learn. But like you said, being able to explore something on your own without, if a teacher says, hey, do this assignment or else, and they're not interested in what it is they're teaching, why would you want to do that assignment? What there's a disconnect between our basic psychology and the role that this institution is supposed to play. And I think a lot of it is protected by the implications of saying, okay, well, maybe you have to be this type of person to do this type of job in this instance. And also the need for teachers, because we always need teachers. So I don't know.
Right. Framing, I think, is an important part too. I nearly flunked out of my pre-calculus class in high school. I struggled
Mm-hmm.
with it a lot. My teacher was not only not inspiring, but he just was bad at teaching, honestly,
Right.
and he just wasn't a
Yeah.
very kind person, right? And then I needed to take calculus for graduate school applications to economic schools, because things get very, very math based as you kind of
Mm-hmm.
climb up the ladder with the study of econ. And I just framed it in a way where I was, first of all, my teacher was much better. She was great and she was passionate about the subject and she explained things clearly. And I was also there for a higher purpose. I wasn't there to learn calculus. I was there to learn calculus so I could get into grad school, right?
Right.
And just even that little bit of framing caused me to take so much more initiative when it came to learning math, which is a subject that I'm not usually very stoked to be learning in the first
Totally.
place, you know?
Right. Well,
Um,
and to be
and
able to see
like,
the math within the social aspect of economics too is so interesting. Someone can really, anyway, I'll let you take that.
no. I want to hear you unpack that
Well,
thought a little bit more.
I was gonna say that, math to me has always been I'm a much more word oriented person. So math to me has always been very abstract and just sort of like there's one right answer and this is how you find it. And it's very process driven. Um, but, I'm interested in economics, even though I don't know that much about it, because math can explain social phenomenon, which is essentially what economics is. And so it takes on a different, again, the framing of it takes on a different meaning. Like I love taking statistics because statistics is the study of human behavior more in some ways.
Right,
Yeah.
absolutely. And it's funny because there's, I think, different schools of economic thought that have been developed based off of their math emphasis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like back in the early 1900s, one of the leading schools of thought at the time was what's referred to as the Austrian school, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not the economics of Austria. It's literally there's a bunch of dudes in Austria that developed this new
This
form of
theory.
economic thought,
Mm-hmm.
right? And their entire perception initially is very human behavior, psychology, even you could even say anthropology based, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's just a set of logical deductions. Like they were the ones that invented this idea of marginal utility, which I'll explain that because I know that's a kind of jargon to some people,
Right.
but literally the simple idea that like you're at an all-you-can-eat buffet and you can eat as much food as you want, and you're a big pizza fan, so you're probably just going to eat pizza the entire time at this free buffet, right? And the first pizza that you eat is going to be great, and then there's literally going to get to a point where you don't want to eat anymore, you're full, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like that's a super basic concept if we think about it, but it's human behavior based, where like your subjective value for the exact same thing is decreasing with each additional unit that you get,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
That's a very
absolutely.
human behavior based abstraction, right? Like that you're
Totally.
just literally thinking out like, okay, how would a regular person behave in this situation?
Right.
um but then we've also moved, there's different schools of thought that promote like uh, very intense mathematical models and talk about
Mm-hmm.
behavioral economics, and they try to model human behavior using like all these aggregate charts and data sets that they get and try to make sense out of those. And those two schools of thought are at odds because one is saying here's your base things on how humans act and we're going to
Mm-hmm.
build upon that, and other ones are saying let's take these large data sets and try to abstract human behavior out of them, right?
Right.
Those clash naturally, right? And there's some
Mm-hmm.
debate that happens there as a result. um, but it's interesting because I feel like both are right and not necessarily every economist wants to make that stance because that means my
Right.
side has to lose or whatever.
Totally. Totally.
But I think that there's definitely benefit to looking at it from both perspectives. And I think that, again, it's a politicization thing, right? The Austrian
Mhm.
school, for whatever reason, is now getting attached to right-wing people, and
Interesting.
econometrics and calculus-based economics is now a left-wing thing. And I'm like,
Hmm.
these things can exist in harmony with one another. It's
Simultaneously.
right, because it's not like, people in science that there's disagreements in climate change and physics and things like that.
Totally.
It's not like we're politicizing them where it's like, oh, if you believe in string theory, you must be a Republican, right? That's
Yeah.
not how we think about
Well,
it.
and I mean, you can make the analogy of like the weatherman. You know, he has to report on trends that are unpredictable, but are still somewhat predictable. I mean, I guess you could say like macroeconomics on some level is so complex that all you can do is essentially look at trends with the added context of data to make broad assumptions or very specific assumptions about like certain human behaviors. But to me it seems like they kind of rely on each other. I'd imagine that like with any field, once you become sort of pigeonholed in one sort of area and that becomes your expertise, and I mean this, we could talk about the way that academia works too in this sense, but you're incentivized not to step outside of that box in a way.
No, absolutely. Economics is 100%, probably even more than a lot of sciences. It's
Hmm.
expected that you kind of stay in that lane, and your perception, is the one that you kind of stick with, and other people are, antithetical to whatever your worldview is when it comes
Yeah.
to economics.
Yeah.
And again, like, I get it. Humans, first of all, humans are tribal, and second of all, humans always want to be right. So all that counteracting data can be something you want to either shy away from or make an enemy out of. But
Totally.
I don't think that's necessary, because I think
Hmm.
that like a lot of the Austrian guys bash on a dude named John Maynard Keynes, Keynesian
Hmm.
economics, right? And
I've heard that
his
term.
whole
Yeah.
thing, well, his whole idea that he, kind of abstracted was, if the economy's doing bad, just give people stimulus and they're going to start spending and the economy will start doing better. And you might have to go into some debt in order to make that happen because you're just giving people money out of nowhere, but that will hopefully offset the fact that you stay in a recession for longer, right?
Right.
Um,
But
and
that
again,
could backfire too. I mean, I
so,
was
and
just
that's
thinking
what the
about,
Austrians say, is
yeah.
that they'll say that doing that causes what they refer to as malinvestment, where
Hmm.
money's not going to the right places and you don't see those bubbles popping in that malinvestment until the next recession. It's
I
the
was
thing
just
that
learning
causes the
about
next recession.
I was just learning about the situation that India was in a few years ago, where they not reset their currency, but they voided. Basically, I mean, the Reader's Digest version is older generations in India. It's mostly a cash-based society. They would basically keep their money under the pillow and they wouldn't spend it. And a lot of these older people had certain bills that they weren't circulating anymore, but they still had value. And India is a huge country, so millions of people were doing this. And the Indian government was going, oh shit, we have to collect taxes on this. So they gave people a certain amount of time for them to turn that money in to be to be yeah, taken by the government, taxed, and then given back in the form of new currency. And it was
That's
like
very interesting.
a complete nightmare. People, 100,000 people died or something crazy like that, and there were lines just up to ATMs for like a 2 week wait just to get to an ATM to cash your old money in because it was now void.
Right.
And I guess I could see that as being like a potentiality for something like, is it Keynesian economics? Is that how you
Yeah.
pronounce it?
Yep.
Keynesian, yeah,
Yep.
something like that.
So, and monetary economics is a specialty of mine, but it also can get really hard to follow. So I'm going to,
Yeah,
do my best to not get too wonky with this
yeah,
stuff. But
totally.
the Indian government considers cryptocurrency a threat for similar reasons, right?
Hmm.
Because it shakes their already unstable monetary system, and they're afraid of it. So they are doing their best to outlaw it, which is not going to go well for them. I don't know how you outlaw a set of thousands of decentralized online currencies. I
Right.
think they're going to find that to be very difficult. But it's
Hmm.
just interesting because I think it's only a matter of time before governments in more established economies are going to have to make some very careful considerations, because Bitcoin and its growth is a bet against the dollar. It is
Right.
saying this current monetary system that we have is not working, and it's
Mhm.
making people disadvantaged, and we're going to move to a better monetary system, and this is what that's going to be.
Yeah.
That's the, the general idea of why Bitcoin is something that has value, because otherwise it's literally just code, right?
Right.
um, and governments don't care about that now, but
Mhm.
if you hit, a $3 trillion market cap and you have 1.5 billion people using Bitcoin, governments are going to
Right.
get scared, because that means the
Absolutely.
American dollar looks weak. That means the euro looks weak, etc. So,
Right.
that's going to create a lot of interesting controversy over the next decade or so.
Yeah. I used to work with a guy back in like 2014, and he was one of the first people to buy Bitcoin. And he was like, I was a line cook, and so I was working with a lot of crazy people, because that's just the type, crazy people or work as line cooks. And and he was like one of the first people to get in on the Bitcoin thing, and he was trying to get me in on it. He was like, dude, you got to buy Bitcoin, like, and I totally regret it now, but I'm sure I've lost touch with him, but I'm sure he is rolling in it now. And just this last 6 months, I've started getting involved in cryptocurrency. And the way I look at it is, why wouldn't it continue to climb? There's no Fed, what would inhibit it from continuing to raise in value?
So right now, the only thing that would inhibit it is faith, right?
Right.
And people of, economists everywhere, I think, are discrediting it because of the fact that um, it's they're treating it like a stock, right? People are
Hmm.
acting like, oh, it's a Bitcoin bubble and it's overemphasis and this, but people are forgetting, right? We invest in stocks because we think a company is going to do well and that's going to generate a return. We
Hmm.
do not invest in cryptocurrencies for those things. Now, some people are. Some
Totally.
people are investing into crypto because they want to make a quick buck or whatever, and they're not really
Hmm.
thinking of the abstract of it. But at the end of the day, I think its growth is more so because of the fact that when our financial system starts to look rocky, people are
Hmm.
going to take money out of the current financial system in the stock market and throw it into crypto, because crypto doesn't look rocky.
Right.
And there's going to, I think, a bubble is occurring with Bitcoin right now. And
Hmm.
again, I think it's more so a faith bubble, right? Like it's crossed the 50,000 threshold. That's great. I think we're due for a correction, just because there's a lot of people putting a lot of effort into scaring people out of Bitcoin at this point, because they're
Absolutely.
seeing how, right, Tesla's adding it to its balance sheet, Apple's
Right.
adding it to its balance sheet, these are companies that are usually pretty wise with their money. I don't think they'd be buying $1 billion of bullshit if they didn't think it was going to have value in the future. And I think
Absolutely.
that's the reason why they're accepting it as a currency now, right?
Do you
Um,
think how much of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency do you think the value? Because yeah, I think what you said, it is a bet against the dollar. I do think, and I've had conversations with people who are involved in the, very involved with cryptocurrency, and people who are involved with cryptocurrency are very, that's it's kind of like they're like vegans. It's like all they can talk about. Um, but they say that a lot of it, friends of mine who are into it say that really the technology too behind a lot of these cryptocurrencies is uh, almost like a product itself, can be used for so many different things, like the blockchain. I've heard talk about like blockchain voting systems and things like that. So how much do you think different technologies popping up within the cryptocurrency sphere kind of relates to the value of cryptocurrency as a whole?
yeah, so I think blockchain is incredibly useful. And I think the ability to document things from an independent source and have all of those types of verifications that go along with it is great. Um,
Mhm.
I think, and voting's a great example of that. I also think that blockchain is going to be one of the only ways that we're going to have to go about encrypting things eventually, because I think quantum computing, as that develops, is going to eventually pose a threat to the way that we have security for everything, right? And
Right.
not to get into a nerdy conversation about that, but we're at a point where we can develop computers that can crunch massive amounts of math calculations and algorithms at once, and that being so advanced would threaten like a a 10 digit or 15 or 20 digit password, right?
Right.
Because it could crunch through all of that until it finds the right password super
Yeah.
quickly.
And it's not,
That's
and
scary to think about.
it is scary to think about, but it's not a binary system. It's not working through. And again, I don't know, you probably know more about quantum computing than I do. But from what I understand of it, it's kind of confusing because it gets down to like the atomic level more or less, or like the subatomic level. But you know, it basically can look at all of the possibilities of, let's say, you know, okay, what's your 5-digit code? Okay, there's a million possibilities for what a 5-digit password could be on someone's computer, but a quantum computer can essentially look at all combinations of those simultaneously ish.
Yes, that's pretty much it. So the best way to describe it is that you know, quantum computing, as you add bits to it,
Mm-hmm.
is exponentially increasing its computing power, right?
Hmm.
So as we figure out how to actually make a quantum computer work, which is at the atomic level, and that's the tough part, you're
Right.
getting more and more computing possibilities at once, a huge bang for your buck as far as space it takes up and the amount of processing power it can achieve. And that's exactly what it is. So people are thinking, okay, if we get to that point, then like is our like banking security going to just be a giant race for who can make the best quantum encrypted thing? And as soon as somebody makes another stronger quantum computer, that becomes threatened. And
Right.
people's proposed solution to that is blockchain, because of the fact that, okay, we can verify that this is coming from the same person, but have all of this independent encryption that allows it that a quantum computer couldn't figure that out, right?
Gotcha. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
so that's kind of where that extra value component is. And I don't know, I can't say that this is something we'll be seeing soon by any means.
Right.
This is probably, we're probably talking 20 years down the line. So there's a whole lot of speculation that can happen with that. But yeah, I mean, I think the combination of blockchain and displacing the dollar and having an alternative way to go, and the fact that you can make money off of it presently, are all great things
Yeah.
that are going to continue, Bitcoin's claim to fame here.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I mean, so this is a fact that I learned the other day, is that
Mm-hmm.
Bitcoin currently has the same number of users as the internet did in 1997,
Damn.
except the adoption rate is outpacing the internet. So Bitcoin's
Jeez.
supposed to reach 1 billion users within the next 4 to 5 years.
Yeah.
Well, from 1997, it took the internet until 2005 to hit 1 billion users.
Right.
So that's
And
just something to
that was
consider.
with the .com bubble too in there too.
Yeah, so and that's why people are projecting a Bitcoin bubble, is the
Yeah.
amount of liquidity and the amount of users that are flooding into it is overvaluing it presently. That
Totally.
doesn't necessarily mean that it's overvalued forever, but right
Mm-hmm.
now there might be a little too many people getting too excited about the prospect, and that's something.
Totally.
I have holdings in a bunch of Bitcoin and crypto, but I'm watching all of it carefully, because
Yeah.
everything's looking really good right now. And last time people were saying, "Wow, this is great, everybody's going to get rich," the dot-com bubble happened. So
Yeah. When it looks too good, yeah, it might probably won't last. So yeah, I wanted you wanted to talk about the welfare system and the welfare state a little bit, and I would love to get into that with you because I've recently been kind of digging into like Thomas Sowell a little bit. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
very, yeah.
Um, and just trying to get a more just kind of a more nuanced understanding of the uh, the cause and effect of certain things in the welfare, because people, and again, a lot of understandably so, and I was for a long time, it's like, well, you know why not universal basic income? Why not this? Why can't I just have money in my pocket if I'm someone who works a kind of menial job? Um, and I think very little attention has been paid to the consequences of these things, and it's not politically advantageous in a lot of ways to be the person in the room that goes, yeah, actually, here's why that is not necessarily a good idea.
Yeah, so this is a big topic, and I might talk
Mhm.
at length for a bit, but I promise
Please.
I've had this conversation a lot of times, and
Yeah.
I'm heading towards a conclusion. So,
Yeah.
so there's a few factors, and I'm going to come right out and say that I'm actually more left-wing than many of my free market colleagues when
Hmm.
it comes to welfare.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, we're going to go and talk through a few things here. So,
Mhm.
first of all, people forget that money is worthless without supply, right? You have, okay, that demand component is fed. You have money, and you can go get stuff with that money. But equally as important is the fact that there's stuff to buy at a reasonable price. All the money in the world doesn't solve that. So that's something worth remembering, is that we need to keep the monetary thing in bounds to a degree, just so that our system works properly.
Hmm.
The other thing to mention with that is, like inflation and stuff like that, right? Like if we're going to be uh, supplementing people with money, we need to be very careful about how much printing we're doing so that we don't devalue the money, right?
Right.
So when people were like making a lot of claims, with COVID about we need stimulus, and I completely agree, we did need stimulus at that time. We should have had 5 times the stimulus that we ended up getting with the amount that we spent, if not more. But
Right.
you also have to remember that there weren't as many people working then. So what is that
Right.
money going to get you if all the supply chains are broken down? So there's
Totally.
my first point. Second point is that work is a lot more important than just, a means to an end for money. Work creates fulfillment, and work creates value, more importantly. Your labor has an inherent value to it that's good for your community and society, right? And the paycheck that you get from that is the paycheck that you get from that, but you got to remember that you're serving your community. So when I talk about welfare state, I don't want people not having jobs. I just want people to have more access to basic things that you need to live.
Right.
So now into my final 2 points. I am very much anti-minimum wage, which makes people very upset on a pretty frequent basis, but I'll explain why. But I am pro UBI. And the
Interesting.
reason why is because minimum wage creates a lot of adverse effects that UBI does not create. So for example, and I'll try not to get too jargony with the econ stuff, because a lot of conservatives
get
make a lot
jargony, because
very...
I'll put in I'll put in show notes too that define certain things and all that kind of stuff too.
That would be great. So a lot of conservatives make a lot of really bad arguments for minimum wage, and it clouds my argument a lot of the time, and that bothers me. And it's basically like, oh well, you just should work harder, pull up by your bootstraps. The people before you weren't complaining. What's another one? Prices are going to increase, which is a secondary effect but not a primary effect. The primary effect of minimum wage is that it increases unemployment, and that is my main concern with it. So pretty much, if you were to take, a supply and demand type thing, consider the demand people that are looking for laborers, right? And then the supply is the labor that's being provided, right? So, there's McDonald's is looking for X number of workers at X price, and there's so many people that are willing to supply it at that price, and you reach, in theory, some form of equilibrium, and that kind of sets the wage, right? So minimum wage in that context is what would be considered a price floor, which means that it's setting the price and saying you can't go beneath that price, right? If that price floor is below that equilibrium amount, it's not going to have an effect on anything, which is actually what I'd argue our current minimum wage is, the federal minimum wage, of whatever it is, $7.50 an hour or $7.25 an hour. That's well below, I think, our standard equilibrium at this point. 1% of adults currently are working at the federal minimum wage. Everybody else is above that. I mean, and even if you go and look at starting wages at McDonald's or Panda Express.
California minimum wage is, I think, $12.50 now. Give or take.
And I mean, Michigan's is, I think, only $9.50, but the starting wages at places like McDonald's are still $13-14 an hour. But I'll get into explaining why. That price floor, if it goes above equilibrium, you get what would be considered a surplus of labor. Now, if you think about a surplus at like a Costco, and you have too much of something, they're going to lower the price to try to get rid of it, right? We have too much of what people want of this item, and the only way that we're going to get rid of it is to lower the price so that more people than usual would buy it, right? But we made that illegal. You made lowering your price illegal. So that surplus of labor is really just a different word for increased unemployment. And
interesting.
There's a lot of discussions to be had, and there's a lot of studies that go one way or another. And that's because obviously life is complicated, and not that one size fits all principle isn't going to work everywhere. But I would say you can still visualize that better if you take the wage argument to an extreme. It becomes very obvious what that's going to create if you say make the minimum wage $40 an hour. Then that unemployment law that we think about becomes so obvious. You're not going to have everybody working at $40 an hour. You're going to have some people working at $40 an hour and everybody else without a job. The Congressional Budget Committee for this most recent minimum wage proposal said exactly that. 900,000 people were going to get a raise out of the situation, and 1.5 million people were going to lose their jobs. That was the projection, right? And that's because, Birmingham, Alabama is probably not going to be a place that has a $15 minimum wage anytime soon, because the cost of living there is totally different than living in New York. Now, to move that conversation into UBI.
Mhm.
UBI is not setting a price floor. If
Mhm.
I am getting $1,000 a month, I can still go and choose to sell my labor for $9 an hour if I choose to, right?
Right.
So this creates a lot of good things, right? Minimum wage usually helps corporations and hurts small businesses. That's why Jeff Bezos is a supporter of minimum wage, just because he
Mhm.
knows it's going to murder his retail competition that are already struggling, and he's going to have the power to pay his workers $15 an hour, right?
Absolutely.
Um, but UBI doesn't cause that. UBI actually gives people more leverage with their wages because they can be like, I don't need you that bad. I don't need
Right.
you for my insurance. I don't need you to feed my family because I'm getting $1,000 a month from the source that I will
Absolutely.
have no matter what.
Mhm.
So you're either going to pay me what I feel like I'm worth, or I'm going to walk and go somewhere else. It's one
Totally.
great thing.
Mhm.
Another great thing is all research on UBI so far suggests that things are spent on economically valuable causes, right? This idea that if you supply people with welfare, they're going to go and get hooked on drugs and alcohol and not work a job to save their life is, first of all, it's a really stupid perception that people have.
Right.
But second of all, the data shows that's not the case. People
Most
use
people
the
hooked
money.
on drugs, most people who are, my brother is a heroin addict, and he, I mean, he's currently incarcerated, but the idea that he would even, um, he would even be cognizant enough to be aware that this is something, I mean, people who are addicted and really mentally ill have way larger, the scale of problems in their life is unimaginable to us, and much of like the conception of the reality that you and I live in is kind of, sadly, it's kind of taken from them. So I agree that, like, even throughout COVID, you know, I'm a bartender. I've worked, last year I worked 4.5 months kind of on and off, and
Mm.
the money that I was getting, I was reinvesting that. I was putting that into things that are valuable for me. I was thinking of it as, I don't know what the next year is going to look like. So I want to have, you know, I want to have, support myself as much as I can. But um, yeah, I think that also too, UBI gives people who, you know, I think that, you know, and you and I can relate to this since we're both musicians, but it gives artists a little bit more of a cushion to actually pursue meaningful things in society, and that
Absolutely.
actually really matters. People, and again, and I'm more of a center left, center, you know, some of the issues I go sort of center right on, but like, we need to get back to create. We need to be able to have people creating valuable art, because we're kind of seeing the same thing on a large scale with the music industry, where uh, just like Jeff Bezos is supporting a higher minimum wage because it's going to destroy the rest of his competition. You see huge small bands crushed, and those who can support themselves to produce content are doing fine. And it's
Right.
creating just a, the hierarchy now is, the top of it is just kind of full of bullshit, in my opinion.
And I think creative entrepreneurship is the future. Like it literally,
Absolutely.
because as we're automating a bunch of jobs away, one thing that algorithms and AI cannot do is be creative.
Yep.
There's something inherently human about art and creativity that speaks to us, and every single time AI has attempted that, it has been a cold and sterile and dismal kind of attempt, right?
Mhm.
So I think UBI would be great in aiding that, and just entrepreneurship in general, right? If you had
Yeah.
an extra $1,000 a month to invest or to put towards your business or things like
Or to risk, yeah, to say, okay,
yeah,
you know what, like, like most people, I don't know what the statistic is now, but I was reading something like 45-50% of Americans don't have $1,000 in their savings account. And it's like, that
it's
to me
devastating.
is, that's crazy, because, you know, most of my life that's been me, and I have been very
Same.
lucky where where my car breaks down, but I don't happen to break my leg in the same month. You know, because if that happened to me, I'd be fucked. I don't know what I would do. You know, I would, like, it would be, I'd have to get help from family, and I don't know how well my, you know, what family member I'd have to ask, or what they're going through, and it would
Right.
just be a nightmare. And so many people are dealing with that, or with their kids, and yeah, it's just crazy. Something's not working.
And before moving on, because I
Hmm.
think that there's a really great jumping off point from there into kind of income inequality in general, which is
Yeah.
something most people don't understand. And again, I'm on your, the left side with income inequality. It's a huge issue,
Right.
and I'll address it in a second. But just to sell UBI a little bit more, I think there's two other
Mm-hmm.
things that it does better than our current welfare system. One is, you were referencing previously an issue where you have to be so poor to qualify for some kind of healthcare benefits, and even though some people are poor, they still are making enough money to,
Yeah.
have or be expected to pay for their own healthcare. The welfare state is a similar thing where as soon as you're making $1 more than what would be considered appropriate for your situation, you get all your benefits taken away, and that's devastating for people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think UBI gets rid of that, which is great because then it creates an incentive to get to work and improve your situation instead of a fear that you're going to lose benefits, which,
Right.
I think a lot of people who just, suffered through unemployment this past COVID pandemic can, agree with that if they had $1,000 a month, that wouldn't be as scary to maybe hop off of unemployment because, finding a job that could get shut down at any point when you're
Right.
collecting money from unemployment is there's a risk factor there that you
I'm
don't
the
want to have to
I'm
take.
the example. Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
my restaurant's supposed to go back to, I'm supposed to go back to work next month. And, for the last 2 months, I've been getting, well, I mean, basically getting like $600 a week, which
Right.
isn't great, but I'm in school full time. So if I were to go and start working, if I were to go and get a job in a grocery store 3 days a week, making minimum wage or whatever during the weekend, I would be making significantly less money than I would by just collecting the insurance benefits that I'm
Mhm.
collecting. So there's no incentive for me
Right.
to.
Same thing. I lost my job that was at school. I was
Mm,
working a school job, and that when COVID happened, obviously I lost that job pretty quickly. And same thing. I mean, I signed up for unemployment because I lost my job due to shutdowns, and then I decided to instead take the risk to go work an internship in Texas. But that
mm,
was a scary situation to be like, okay, I'm
totally.
going to give up all this great free money that's giving me a nice cushion during this pandemic and go take a massive pay cut to move across the country to go take a risk on a job,
Right.
right? And in hindsight, that worked out well for me, and I'm happy that I did it. But like most people would not be considering that in the situation just because of how risky and dangerous everything is given the recession. There's a lot of
Right.
uncertainty, and
Right.
it could have taken a lockdown in Texas for me to be in the same situation I was with school, and then I'd be out of state, so I couldn't qualify for unemployment again.
Totally. Yeah, man.
So no, I definitely think and also UBI saves money. If we
Yeah.
replaced our entire welfare state with a UBI, it'd save us about $1 trillion. So
Crazy.
why not? Yeah,
Right.
it's
Yeah.
I don't see I think the pros for a UBI greatly outweigh the cons, and I think it would encourage people to work and be entrepreneurs, and I think that we don't have enough of
So
that.
are you a Yang supporter?
I was a fan of his, yes.
Yeah. I like
Him and
Yang.
Tulsi were my two favorites in the Democratic primary, so it's sad that they didn't really even come close
Yeah,
to making it to the finish line.
they got just what, MSNBC and CNN and all the, just leave it, like misspelling Andrew Yang's name. It's honestly, it's pretty crazy, the disinformation campaign that they ran against both of them, leaving them off the graphics. It's
Yeah, I mean
yeah, it was a very big
it's
red pill
very
moment for a lot
standard.
of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and we already saw how they treated Bernie, not just this election, but last election too. I
Right.
mean, they definitely have their establishment babies, and if you're not one of those establishment babies, they want to have nothing to do with you,
Hmm.
which is really unfortunate. But yeah, I guess the kind of the closing conversation we can have here, which I'm sure
Hmm.
will take up still a decent amount of time,
Yeah.
is talking about people not having savings, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is a direct result of income inequality, which is a massive problem in the United States. And I hate the
Hmm.
fact that there's this idea that people aren't willing to acknowledge the fact that there is a huge disparity in the way capital is moving in the United
Right.
States.
Yeah.
And again, like, these are things I can only kind of whisper amongst like free market circles, but it's true.
Hmm.
But
It's
I
totally
attribute
true.
it to something different than capitalism bad and rich man bad. I don't
Hmm.
really think that's the situation. I think what's happening is monetary policy, which is
Hmm.
printing money, rapid expansion of the monetary base.
Hmm.
Because I sent you that website, the WTF happened in 1971.
Hmm.
And what happened in 1971 is that we abandoned the gold standard and we had no check for how much money we were printing and throwing into the market.
Right.
And The result of that is that, first of all, money's getting devalued over time at a rapid rate,
Mhm.
a much faster rate than it previously was. But the important thing to remember here is that that's a very advantageous situation if you already have money,
Mhm.
and that's a very disadvantaged situation if you don't. And the reason why is because as money is getting printed and you have to go into debt because you're in a recession, we have tools for helping smooth out recessions a little bit, and one of those
Mhm.
is expanding the monetary base, lowering interest rates, making money cheap.
Mhm.
Oh, great. Money's cheap, and the people that needed it really bad have it now, but at a price, which is a price of inflation and a price of debt. Then the recession's over and you're back into, a more stable economic period. The people that had to go into debt during the recession are now clawing their way back to normalcy. And they better hope that they claw their way back to normalcy before that next recession hits.
Right.
On the flip side of it, all the people that didn't have to go into debt are really enjoying the fact that money is as fluid as it is, and they get to invest in new businesses and
Mhm.
consolidate more capital and make more money, and take advantage of all the people that are spending just
They
to
have an
survive.
opportunity to win the game more.
Exactly. And I'm
Mhm.
not even saying that to make those people sound bad. That's what any decent businessman would do if they weren't in
Right.
debt, right? I mean, they're
Totally.
just trying to provide services for the economy to keep things afloat.
Right.
As much as, we enjoy hating on Bezos as a society, I would argue that Amazon kept a lot of America afloat during the pandemic
Mhm.
because there was no other way we can get, literally any product imaginable pooped at our doorstep 2 days, after we
Absolutely.
order it.
And
Uh,
also, I just want to interrupt for a second and remind people that Bezos, people have this idea that he has like all of his money sitting in a checking account somewhere and he can just spend it freely.
right.
But but that's, I mean, it's all a valuation. It's not liquid cash. That's not the way that.
No, it's literally all of his share of ownership of
Right.
Amazon, and
So
people,
when the
and
company gains value, he becomes richer. I think
exactly.
that's a point that just never gets made. It drives me crazy.
The headlines for COVID drove me nuts. Where it's like Jeff
Right.
Bezos, among all the people suffering, Jeff Bezos, made an extra whatever $20 billion through the pandemic, and it's like
Right.
he didn't make it. Every single person on the face of the earth relied on Amazon to get some good to them over the
Hmm.
past year,
Absolutely.
and that just happened to be Jeff Bezos's business that he owns a very large portion of.
Yeah.
And in order for him to collect on that, he'd have to liquidate all of that, you know,
Right.
which he's not going to do because he's trying to expand the business.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a misconception, and I get it. I mean, we don't.
Hmm.
I think that the idea of people consolidating very large amounts of capital isn't a good thing at all for an
Totally.
economy. But I think people need to remember that we don't live in a zero-sum game either.
Hmm.
People getting wealthy does not make other people poor. In fact, quite the opposite. If people are actually creating services of value, it's making everybody richer in the
Right.
process. And while I don't think that Jeff Bezos should be worth, quite as much as he is, and I'd actually make the argument that it's more regulation at play than capitalism bad.
Hmm.
I would say that Amazon was definitely doing something of value this past year. I don't think
Right.
anybody would take a moment to argue against that. And
Right.
I don't like the idea of monopolies one bit. But
Hmm.
the fact that they had the shipping services nailed and their supply chains were relatively unobstructed, and there was huge demand for what they did because nobody could leave their house. It did something positive that I would say that less developed countries didn't get to take advantage of, right?
Yeah.
Less developed countries either couldn't lock down or they did lock down and they did not get to live as lavishly as Americans did during the time that they were sitting at home. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
it's a tough conversation, and I don't want to sound like I'm, being like too much of a shill for rich people and billionaires and
No.
stuff like that. I want to tread lightly when I
Well,
get into
it's always
conversations.
it's very easy to recognize. It's very easy to recognize the disparity, and of course, income. Again, this whole thing would be a lot easier if people generally had. I mean, I look at my grandparents' generation as a good example because my grandpa, he was the vice president of Chevron for 20 years, and
Hmm.
he worked his way up from a gas station attendant in the 1950s. And so the corporation as it existed then was a benevolent thing. It helped him. It paid for him to go to college. It really they saw him as someone who worked hard and they valued him as an employee. And within that system, he was able to create wealth for, um, you know, others and my family. And I'm not saying I'm rich, by the way, because I'm definitely not. And my extended family, they're like very type A, like, you know, you have to get everything that, you know, they're very like meritocracy driven people. But like my grandpa reinvested all that into the CSU system in California and all sorts of stuff. And
Right.
it's kind of a different, when we have conversations with, for example, like older generations, again, this framing for them. The corporate America as it was then kind of was a little different than we perceive it to be now. And it correlates to the data. I mean, just looking at like the tax rates on wealthy people in the 50s, they were much higher than they are now. I think it was like what, 35% or something, like it was pretty high.
So it
Um,
depends because the brackets extended further, and
okay.
then the taxes continued to. So like what is it now? Like you make over $400,000. That's the cutoff, right? So 400 people that make 400 grand a year and billionaires are literally paying the same tax rates.
Right.
That's
Do
kind
you
of
think
silly.
there should be more tax brackets?
Yeah, I don't think
Mm,
that could hurt. It's tough because I think that a progressive tax system is the only one that really makes sense at this point in time, especially with the amount of money that our government's spending.
mhm.
And this just is an important thought that I just remembered too. But we have to be careful about the idea of just taxing rich is going to solve all of our problems. And the reason
Right.
why is because if you took, and I repeat this fact until I'm blue in the face because I think it addresses a problem that people don't want to address,
Mhm.
is if you took every single billionaire in the United States and totaled every single dollar they've made from the minute they were born to now, their
Mhm.
entire net worth, everything they've ever owned and currently own, and taxed that and took it all away, it would have lasted 5 months of
Mm.
the government's 2020 budget. And then all your
Crazy.
billionaires and value creating rich people are gone, and you still have an additional what was the math I just said? 6-7 months
Right.
of budget that you need to spend.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the idea that we can tax ourselves into prosperity is one that literally the math doesn't work out, and we fill in the gaps with one, debt, and two, printing money, and that works
Right.
for so long because we have leverage right now. Um, I think people really like, oh, the debt, the debt, the debt. Especially free market people are always worried about that, and yeah, we should be worried
Totally.
about the debt, but like, if you have debt on your balance sheet, but you also have the American economy on your balance sheet, the debt doesn't matter quite as much. You know
Right.
what I
Right.
mean?
Hmm.
But those things need to be held within balance. You can't just print money to solve all problems, or else you're, going to end up with a Weimar Republic or Venezuela. Um,
Totally.
but and same thing with taxation, right? Like taxation is necessary to keep the balance sheet in check, but we can't kid ourselves that eating the rich and taking all their money is going to solve some very legitimate systemic issues right now.
Hmm.
It's just
Hmm.
going to shift power from one place to another, and that doesn't solve anything for
Right.
anybody.
Yeah.
So
And also, relating to that, and I know it's late on your end, so we'll tie it up here. But
sounds
um,
good.
the and I'm more of a left leaning person, and I recognize that most people are really dealing with some, especially this year, really dealing with some hard stuff. And I think the rich are the easy targets in a lot of sense. Um, and it's like this. I've been reading a lot about the Soviet Union and how they dealt with. And I'm not saying that we're anywhere near the Soviet Union after the revolution, but what happened is the most of the rich people, and I've dug into the research on this. Very few rich people don't just are rich without any skill sets or any. Most rich people are adding some sort of value, and it can, of course, the economy can, like Bezos is a great example. Um, everyone needed to use Amazon this year, so the price went up. It's not like he was pushing a lever. I want more money, I want more control over the world. That's not, I doubt that that's what he was thinking. But you immediately disappear. Someone like that disappears, and what you're left with is, one less rich person to hate, but an entire thing that the country relies on just is gone, you know. And the way it played out in the Soviet Union was the farmers who knew how to farm usually had the most land and usually had the most skills, and they were seen as class enemies, and they were murdered or sent off to the gulag. And people who didn't have any skills were sent to farm the land that these rich farmers were farming. And 12 million, 13 million people died because they didn't have the understanding of what it took. And so,
Right.
I think well, go ahead.
So, I mean, and I can kind of close with this to a degree, is that, I said at the beginning, like, economics is this idea of us exchanging with one another and serving our communities. And I think from the bottom to the top, people place value on people that serve others' communities.
Yeah.
And I think, people often make the arguments where it's like, well, a rich person doesn't work 1,000, 10,000, 15,000 than one of their workers. Why do they deserve that? And I would say, when you think about wages and value, don't think about the hardness of the work. I would say think about how replaceable their skill set is. Right.
Absolutely.
There's a reason why Elon Musk literally doesn't sleep at his house and has a bed in his office and,
Totally.
works, 18-hour days. And
Mhm.
I'm not, again, I'm not trying to say that other people can't do that. They definitely can. But he has a skill of he's a conductor of capital, is the way that I say. Like,
a good delegator.
Yeah, because, like, is he inventing the technology himself for Neuralink or Tesla or SpaceX? No, but he has all this money, and he goes, okay, well, let's flow it to these people that have excellent skill sets, that deserve high pay, and can also make something amazing happen.
Absolutely.
And again, he's conducting the capital to all these musicians that are serving, their community in their own respective ways, and that's kind of the way that I look at it. And there's definitely some systemic issues there, but I think that general idea of serving your community, and you're going to get rewarded for serving your community, needs to be a functional part of every system, or else you're going to get Soviet Union scenarios.
We can solve income inequality while also having rich people provide services that are necessary and desirable in that economy.
Absolutely.
That's kind of what you're saying.
And again, I don't want people to suffer by any means, and I think that we definitely have some issues that need to be addressed for people at the lower end of the spectrum. But I don't think that the lack of existence of rich people are going to solve any of those issues any faster. Totally. So hopefully this discussion kind of shed some light on the idea that economics, doesn't have to be as political, and that there's a lot of gray areas that are worth entertaining.
Sweet. Well, thank you so much, man, for coming on and being willing to talk about this. And I feel like I learned a lot. So thank you.
I really appreciate the invite and the fact that we've kind of had a line of communication for the past few weeks here. It's been great talking to you.
It's cool. It's one of the great parts about the internet,
Yeah,
you
seriously.
get to stay in touch with someone that you just kind of had a chance encounter with. So
it's really awesome. And thanks again, and really looking forward to seeing what you do with this beyond just, this interview. And I'm definitely going to be looking forward to watching the ones that you release in the future.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Of course.